Before Abraham Lincoln even stepped foot in the Oval Office, Southern states were calling it quits on the Union. South Carolina was the first state to secede on December 20th, 1860, and I'm guessing that's not the warm and fuzzy Christmas present Lincoln had in mind. By the time Lincoln was sworn in March of 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had also seceded. By July 1861, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee had also declared their separation, putting the total at 11. The tension was palpable in everyday American life. This is one of those moments in time where you can really feel history unfolding. Enslaved and free people alike were trying to figure out what would happen next and what role they could play. That being said, war was not inevitable. The bloodiness of the American Civil War was the way everything just happened to play out. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, U.S. History to 1865. So let's not be mistaken. The 11 states that seceded from the Union left over the issue of slavery. For example, in Georgia's Declaration of the Causes of Secession, the second sentence makes it pretty clear. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. Mississippi's declaration was even more bold. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. And Texas simply wouldn't be outdone. Texas was received as a commonwealth, holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Sometimes the historical record isn't clear, like with the Southwest tribes we discussed at the beginning of this course that left behind no written language. This is not one of those times. There's no way to look at the historical record available and argue the Civil War was not fought over slavery. It was. On the other hand, and there's always an other hand with historians, isn't there? Just because the Confederacy was about defending slavery doesn't mean the Union was always about abolishing slavery. Some people, including enslaved people, fought to end slavery from the beginning. But at the time, this wasn't everyone's top priority. For Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War was initially a way of trying to keep the Union together. As he wrote in August 1862, about a year into the Civil War, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." This is the same Abraham Lincoln who issued the Emancipation Proclamation just a few months later in January 1863, and who did eventually decide that the Union must fight to end slavery. His path there was just more roundabout than many people are taught in school. To understand that, first we have to, talk about who was fighting the Civil War. Geographically speaking, the war was fought between the North and the South, or the Union and Confederacy. The Union was made up of the 20 states and territories that didn't secede. They considered themselves the United States and acknowledged Abraham Lincoln as president. They also asserted that the Union was the legitimate, pre-existing country, while the Confederacy was illegitimate. The Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America, was made up of the 11 states that seceded. They selected Jefferson Davis as president and even drafted their own constitution to enshrine the institution of slavery in the South. Not every single state where slavery was legal decided to secede. Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky voted to stay in the Union and formed, along with the new state of West Virginia, a row of border states, which essentially acted as a buffer between the Union and Confederacy. These border states were seen as vital in the war. Lincoln is even reported as saying, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Now that we've been introduced to the major geographic players, we can understand how and where the Civil War started. In April 1861, the Union attempted to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina with food, and the Confederacy issued an ultimatum. All Union forces had to withdraw from the fort or else. Union soldiers stayed, so the Confederacy followed through on their threat and bombarded Fort Sumter. After 34 hours of fighting, the Union surrendered the fort to the Confederacy, and war was declared shortly after. Even though this first conflict was relatively short, It shows how the North and South had two very different wars to fight. On paper, the Union seemed to have serious advantages: more population, railroads, industry, iron, and firearms than the Confederacy. But the Union had the tougher goal because they wanted to make the change happen. To persuade the Confederacy to surrender, it seemed like the Union would have to invade, conquer, and occupy those territories. The command of the Union was also a little bit of a hot mess. Abraham Lincoln struggled to find a general-in-chief and appointed, in order, Winfield Scott, George B. McClellan, and Henry Halleck, all of whom faced lots of defeats and failed to capitalize on victories. On the other hand, the Confederacy was fighting a defensive war, trying to hang on long enough for the Union to give up, and had many well-trained military leaders to fill out their army. At the top was Robert E. Lee, who finished second in his class at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Both the Union and Confederacy wanted Lee as a general, but he chose the South primarily out of loyalty to Virginia and remained a leader throughout the entire war. Between the start of the Civil War in April 1861 and September 1862, the Confederacy defeated the Union a lot in Virginia, at Bull Run, the Shenandoah Valley, and for good measure, Bull Run a second time. We don't have the time to do a play-by-play of everything that happened, so we'll focus on three main battles that altered the course of the war. First up, on September 17, 1862, the Union and the Confederacy clashed at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. 23,000 total soldiers were wounded or killed, but a Confederate retreat gave Lincoln the win he needed to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order issued on January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in territory not occupied by the Union. Yes, you heard that right. Technically, it freed enslaved people in the Confederacy, even though the Confederacy was obviously not listening to what Lincoln had to say, especially when it came to slavery. Lincoln's decision to issue the proclamation was based on military, political, and moral grounds. It was far from an end to slavery, but it did formally allow Black Americans to fight for the Union Army. And as the Union gained more ground, it did extend the boundaries of conditional freedom. The Union's support for emancipation wasn't perfect either. Enslaved people have been risking their lives to fight for freedom and abolish slavery ever since the early days of racial slavery in the colonies. But some members of the Union objected to the Civil War's cost in money and lives, wanting to sue for peace and end the violence. Some opposed emancipation altogether. Second is the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. General Lee believed he needed a victory in the North to convince the Union to sue for peace, in other words, give up. So he marched his army north to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is just 86 miles away from Washington, D.C. A victory in Gettysburg meant that Lee could threaten Washington, D.C., and with the northern capital occupied, it would be pretty hard for the Union to keep fighting. There were between 46,000 and 51,000 casualties total, making the three-day Battle of Gettysburg the bloodiest battle of the entire war. Ultimately, the Union emerged victorious and the war went on. The third battle that altered the course of the war happened in July 1863. Ulysses Grant, a rising general in the Union Army and future president, finally succeeded in capturing Vicksburg, Mississippi after a months-long siege. The victory cut the Western Confederacy off from the east, because Vicksburg was the last Confederate stronghold along the Mississippi River. In March 1864, Lincoln finally had his military leader and put Grant in charge of the entire Union Army. In November 1864, Lincoln was reelected as the president of the Union, endorsing his approach to the war and keeping it going. Lincoln defeated a candidate and former Major General of the Union Army named George McClellan, who would have compromised with the Confederacy. So Grant pressed on the war effort for the Union. One of his generals, William Tecumseh Sherman, led a march westward through Atlanta, Georgia, to the Atlantic coast, setting fire to cities along the way. By this point, the Confederacy was on its last legs. In April 1865, the Union captured the southern capital in Richmond, Virginia. And when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, reports say he had fewer than 10,000 soldiers left. The Civil War was effectively over, but it left a lasting mark on the people who survived it, both soldiers and civilians who saw the horrors of war firsthand. There was still more to be done with slavery too. It wouldn't be until June 19, 1865, when Union forces marched into Galveston, Texas, that news about the end of the war and slavery would reach the enslaved people there. Today, we commemorate the date by remembering Juneteenth. The United States also had a bunch of post-war problems to solve, like how to reintegrate states that were so bent on racial enslavement that they went to war to defend it. Those kinds of feelings don't just go away simply because a general waves a white flag. To many white Americans, the Civil War started out as a war to preserve the Union. But unquestionably, by the end of the Civil War, it was about ending the institution of slavery. Just like the past, what would happen next was hardly inevitable after the war. The country was still fragmented, and there were many different paths forward, and many decisions to be made to put the country back together again. And as we'll see in the next and final episode, any future choices in the United States would be made within the legacies that slavery had carved into the nation over hundreds of years. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about the Study Hall Project and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time.